Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back through time, so settle in. Dim the lights. Let your blanket do its job. Maybe sip some tea, preferably something calming. Lavender, chamomile, or, whatever potion your inner medieval apothecary entrusted you with. And tonight, we are exploring the quietest tragedies of history. Not the kings who rode into battle, not the warriors who fell gloriously, but the queens who fell off the throne, gently, awkwardly, sometimes while being quietly escorted out by armed guards who definitely did not respect their personal space. Yes, forgotten queens, the ones who sat on golden cushions one day and the next day found themselves sitting on, considerably less golden chairs, usually in drafty stone rooms, sometimes without chairs at all. We romanticize the crown, the power, the portraits with pearls and scepters, and that one eyebrow raised like they're judging an invisible servant. But history is very fond of the phrase, and then things went rather badly. So tonight we breathe gently and float through the lives of royal women who didn't quite keep their job title. Let's start with a queen who really tried her best. Even though fate, politics, and a few overly ambitious men had other plans. We begin in England. Where else? Anne Neville, Queen of England for a moment, ghost for centuries. Anne Neville, a queen who existed in such a historical whirlpool that sometimes even historians squint at their notes and say, "Right, so which side was she on again?" Born into a wealthy and politically ambitious family. Daughter of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. Because apparently that was a reasonable nickname in the 1400s. Today we have influencers. Medieval England had king influencers. Same concept, slightly more fatal consequences. Anne grew up in a world made of velvet and daggers. Literal velvet, and often literal daggers. This was the Wars of the Roses, after all, essentially. A long-running political argument between two cousins about who got to sit in the prettiest chair, but with more beheadings. Anne first became a Princess of Wales by marriage when she wed Edward of Westminster. Edward had a reputation for loving battle so much that chroniclers politely described him as keen, which in medieval historian language translates roughly to, he enjoyed fighting in the same way ducks enjoy water, bread, and occasionally mild chaos. But Edward died young in battle. Anne, now widowed before reaching adulthood, suddenly found herself extremely available in a dynastic sense. She married again, this time to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later known as Richard III. Yes, that Richard, the one with the Shakespeare play, and the alleged nephews in the Tower misunderstanding. Unfortunate for everyone involved. When Richard became king, Anne became Queen of England. Briefly, quietly, almost as if she knew she wasn't supposed to make too much noise in this story. Life in royal chambers was not comforting. The crown weighed heavy, literally and figuratively. Rumors whispered, plots brewed. Richard paced. Anne watched power swirl around her like a storm she couldn't outrun. Their only son died young. It broke her heart, because for all the scheming politics, Anne Neville was still a mother who mourned. Soon after, Anne herself died. Illness, most likely. Some say poison because people in the Middle Ages rarely passed away without someone whispering poison in the background like a suspicious pigeon. But historians generally agree she was simply ill. She died at 28, faded from the throne, from life, from memory. Her husband died in battle. Her throne vanished. Her legacy became a footnote. Some queens fall loudly. Anne fell softly, almost like she was never there at all. And sometimes, that is the saddest fall of all. Let's exhale. In, out, and drift forward. Isabella of Portugal, the Duchess who slowly forgot herself. There are forgotten queens who lost their crowns, and there are queens who lost themselves. For this we travel to Burgundy, a place full of banquets, fashionable hoods, trade wealth, and people named Philip. So many Philips. Truly, the medieval world's greatest shortage was not grain, but creativity in naming sons. Here we meet Isabella of Portugal, Duchess, consort, a woman born into the glittering world of Iberian royalty, daughter of a king, married to Philip the Good, who, like many rulers nicknamed the Good, was not always particularly good, but medieval PR departments were strong. Isabella entered the Burgundian court in 1441 like a star gliding across polished marble. Educated, elegant, a diplomatic treasure, she helped her husband govern, negotiated treaties, befriended scholars, hosted lavish feasts where musicians soft. Welcome back. Let your breathing soften again. We're drifting further into the gentle twilight of royal misfortune. Tonight, we continue following the soft footsteps of queens who once sat high and then quietly stepped down, or were nudged, or politely escorted by a group of armed men who had very firm instructions. History is full of heroic queens, fierce queens, scandalous queens. But we are here for the forgotten queens, the ones whose crowns went missing, whose names grew dusty, who lost power the way a candle loses flame. Not suddenly, but with a slow sigh of smoke. Let's settle deeper into the pillow of history and drift to France first. Because France has always been extremely talented at royal drama, usually followed by royal regret. Margaret of Burgundy, a queen who tried to breathe in a suffocating court. Before there was Versailles and powdered wigs, there was medieval Burgundy, where ambition wore silk and secrets hid behind every embroidery stitch. Margaret of Burgundy married Louis, the future king of France, a man described by chroniclers as cunning, suspicious, and generally unpleasant at dinner. Not officially, of course, but you can feel the energy. Margaret entered French court life where elegance met paranoia. Louis adored power, resented smiling, and had the emotional warmth of a slightly damp bread roll. She tried to be the perfect queen, dutiful, poised, quietly suffering through French banquets where everyone had opinions about everything. But political winds shifted. Rumors swirled. Accusations bloomed like poisonous flowers. Margaret was accused, perhaps unfairly, perhaps dramatically, of adultery, the kind of accusation medieval courts loved, because nothing delighted nobles like scandal, as long as it didn't involve them. She was locked away in Chateau Gaillard, a fortress that sounds like a cheerful place, but was not. Cold stones, damp corridors, views of the world she once ruled over, but could no longer touch. She died in captivity. Some say illness. Some say starvation. Some say, well, she inconveniently existed, and medieval kings were allergic to inconvenient women. She left no triumphant return, no tearful, dramatic speech, just quiet absence. The crown passed on. History moved forward. Margaret's name faded like chalk in rain. Sometimes queens fall not because they are weak, but because powerful men decide they must. Let's soften our breath. Let her story drift away gently and float onward. Eleanor of Aquitaine in the quiet years. Yes, Eleanor. Famous, brilliant, larger than life. But even she, one of the most formidable queens in medieval Europe, had years of nothingness, silence, stone walls. After rebelling against her husband, King Henry II, because Eleanor enjoyed agency and Henry enjoyed, well, Henry, she was quietly locked away for 15 years. 15 years of not reigning, of watching the world change from windows and whispers. Imagine, Eleanor, who once commanded armies, rode in armor, negotiated with popes and emperors, now doing embroidery and enforced domestic peace. No throne, no court, just years of polite confinement, like being grounded by history itself. People often remember the triumphant Eleanor who returned, who guided sons, who outlived kings. But the forgotten queen years matter too. The quiet ones, where she waited, endured, folded time like linens. Even mighty queens have chapters where the page barely turns. Eleanor of Austria, the sister who married for everyone else. Let's shift softly to Spain and Portugal. Eleanor of Austria, princess of the mighty Habsburg family, which means she was born into political spreadsheets disguised as humans. She married for diplomacy, twice. First to the King of Portugal, he died. Then to Francis, nun of France, the stylish rival of her own brother, Emperor Charles V. Yes, awkward family dinners were absolutely implied. Eleanor spent much of her second queenship being ignored. Francis preferred his mistresses. His hunting dogs probably got more conversation than Eleanor. Court life swirled around her, brilliant, glamorous, and she stood politely at the edge, smiling, present, unnoticed. When Francis died, Eleanor left quietly, just walked out of French politics as if she had never been queen at all. No dramatic farewell, no power struggle. She simply stepped off the stage, like a performer who never got a spotlight in the first place. She spent her last years drifting between siblings' courts, a royal guest, a respected afterthought, a queen twice over. And yet, she moved through history like a soft draft in a grand palace, felt but not seen. Caroline Matilda of Denmark, exiled for dancing and thinking too much. To Denmark now, a land of icy winds and warm political chaos. Caroline Emma, welcome back. Let your breath settle again. slow like candlelight at the end of a long hallway. We're still walking alongside forgotten queens, women who wore crowns briefly, then spent far longer learning how to carry disappointment more quietly than jewels. Tonight, we drift to courts where silk curtains once shimmered, where servants whispered behind gloved hands, and where queens became almost invisible. Let's float gently onward. Blanche of Bourbon, crowned, abandoned, forgotten. Now we glide to medieval Castile, where tempers burned bright, and marriages were less about romance and more about strategic misery. Blanche of Bourbon married King Peter of Castile. Peter called the cruel, though defenders insisted he was simply firm, which is what medieval chroniclers said when someone ruled with the tenderness of a brick. Blanche was 16, young, golden hair, raised with hope and royal etiquette, and likely a charming optimism that must have faded so fast she barely felt it leave. She married Peter, and 3 days later, he abandoned her. 3 days. One has to admire the efficiency of his neglect. He decided, loudly, publicly, that he preferred his mistress. Blanche was sent away, a queen in name only, sitting in cold rooms with embroidery hoops, surrounded by ladies whose primary skill was sighing sympathetically. Peter imprisoned her soon after, because ignoring your wife, apparently, wasn't enough in 14th century royal etiquette. Blanche died still technically queen, but truly forgotten. A prisoner in velvet-lined sorrow, her crown became paperwork, and her legacy became a footnote between louder kings and louder scandals. Some queens lose thrones with armies. Blanche lost hers with silence. Breathe softly. Let your mind float, like a feather caught in centuries of palace dust. Sophia Dorothea of Tell, locked away for loving wrong. To Hanover now, a land of powdered wigs and very serious furniture. Sophia Dorothea, wife to the future George I of Britain. She was not born to be queen. She simply married inconveniently well. George was stern, prickly, fond of duty and not fond of warmth. Sophia Dorothea, however, enjoyed affection, conversation, feeling alive, and unfortunately, tragically for her, she found a man who returned those sentiments. His name was Königsmark. Charming, dashing, exactly the kind of person the future King of England would dislike on principle. Rumors swirled. Letters were intercepted, as they always are when love walks into a palace uninvited. Königsmark disappeared, almost certainly murdered quietly and efficiently, because royal families have always preferred their scandals tidy. Sophia Dorothea was imprisoned for decades. In a palace, yes, but a prison is still a prison. Even if the wallpaper is imported, she spent 30 years in monotone confinement, pacing halls, reading, praying, listening to rain on stone, remembering footsteps that would never return. She died there, not restored, barely remembered, called queen only in technical terms, like a title carved into marble no one stops to read anymore. A queen punished for wanting to feel loved. Pause. In through the nose, out through the years that drift behind us. Catherine Howard, youth, court, and the quiet aftermath. Now to Tudor England, a place where queens fell almost as often as leaves in autumn. Catherine Howard, young, bright-eyed, barely 16 when she caught Henry VIII's weary royal eye. Henry, at this point, was more memory of virility than reality. But Catherine, she was life, warmth, music, not particularly politically trained, which in Tudor courts was about as safe as swimming with politely smiling sharks. Accusations came. Affairs, they said, whether before marriage or during. It mattered little once whispers began dancing through palace corridors. She was arrested, barely more than a girl, trembling, confused, more frightened than rebellious. She never truly reigned. She fluttered, a butterfly briefly mistaken for a phoenix, only to be caught in the machinery of royal fear and paranoia. Her end was not dramatic in her mind. It was small, trembling hands, a frightened heart, a quiet hallway walk no one wants to imagine for long. But her forgotten queen story isn't the execution. It's the stillness before it, the realization that she had been a queen only in title, never in security, and never in peace. Another crown, brief as breath, lost in youth's soft tragedy. Let's drift away from sadness, but not quickly. This is a slow river. History moves at a lullaby pace tonight. Maria Antonia of Bavaria, a queen who outlived her place. To Saxony, where lace, powdered hair, and painted ceilings attempted to distract everyone from politics. Hey again, let's keep floating along in this gentle river of royal disappointment. Because the history of dethroned queens really is a quiet collection of sighs, tragic exile luggage, and the occasional melodramatic prayer for someone else to be poisoned. Perfect bedtime material. So, let's drift into the candle glow world of another queen who found herself politely escorted out of power, usually by people smiling too hard and holding very sharp swords. Anne Neville, the queen who got everything and nothing. Anne Neville, soft-spoken, pale, born to one of England's richest and most ambitious noble families, and destined to have one of those lives where the universe just kept tapping her on the shoulder, whispering, "Hi, just checking." You thought things were going to work out? Adorable. Anne grew up during the Wars of the Roses, a conflict that cheerfully resembled a soap opera, if every character occasionally solved arguments by cutting someone's head off. She married once, then saw her husband die, then got remarried to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III, who was complicated, slightly suspicious, fond of ominous castles and nephews who had a habit of disappearing. Because, of course, when Richard seized the throne, Anne became Queen of England. You'd think that was her triumphant moment. The court glittering, tapestries waving, everyone politely pretending they didn't just have a small civil war, but Anne never seemed to enjoy it. She was sick often, heartbroken over the death of her only son, and quietly watching as Richard, that charming bundle of historical controversy, began hinting that perhaps, just perhaps, he should remarry someone more fertile. Yes, he planned to trade her in like a medieval horse with a loose wheel. Anne died shortly after. Some whispered poison. Others said heartbreak. The more realistic answer? Illness in an age where half the medical advice involved leeches, prayers, or mercury. Often all three, because why not? Richard died soon after at Bosworth, famously losing both crown and horse. Anne, however, slipped into history almost silently. Buried without a monument. A queen whose triumph lasted only long enough for fate to chuckle and pull the rug out again. The world moved on, and she remained a faded name in a family tree scribbled with too much ambition. Let's float onward.
Queen Alice of the Franks, the princess who waited forever. Now we drift to France. To Alice Capet, a princess sent to England to marry Prince Richard, later Richard the Lionheart. A diplomatic peace offering wrapped in lace and court etiquette. Except Richard never married her. He delayed and delayed. He crusaded. He wrote letters. He practiced dramatic piety. He did everything except say "I do." Meanwhile, poor Alice sat in England, waiting, growing less teenage princess glow and more. A woman who has been politely ignored for 2 decades. Eventually, whispers spread that King Henry II, Richard's father, had made Alice his mistress, which meant Richard's refusal to marry her wasn't just political. It was personal and deeply awkward. Imagine your future husband saying, "Ah, yes, this is Alice. She was engaged to me, but my dad got there first." Yes, history is a long, slow parade of unfortunate romances. Alice was finally married off in her late 30s, practically grandmother age by medieval court gossip standards. Her political value had expired. Her story became a footnote. A pawn never crowned nor celebrated, just carefully moved out of the way. Yet she didn't scream or rebel. She simply faded. One more royal who spent her life waiting for a throne that never bothered to materialize. Whoa, Empress Helena Dragash, powerful, but only once the crown was gone. Let's fade now into Byzantium, land of purple silk and fabulous mosaics, where emperors were an elegant blend of philosopher monks and extremely tired bureaucrats. Helena Dragash married Emperor Manuel II, a dutiful wife, patient, more fond of monasteries than court festivals, the sort of woman who probably sighed politely every time someone mentioned political obligations. When her husband died, she quietly became a nun, as many widowed empresses did. Changed her name, put away the tiara. Probably enjoyed the sudden peace, the way some people enjoy removing tight shoes after a long day. Then came the fall of Constantinople. The empire collapsed. Her son died defending it, and Helena, gentle, quiet Helena, became a symbol of grief in an empire that no longer existed. She never screamed. She prayed, and she waited, and history simply noted her as a footnote, the last Byzantine empress. widowed, then gone. A queen without a throne because the throne itself disappeared. It turns out sometimes queens don't fall. Entire kingdoms follow them down. Whoa, Queen Marie José. Hey again. Let's settle back into that quiet, candlelit corridor of history, where royal footsteps echo faintly, and the scent of old incense lingers in the air like someone really overestimated the importance of spiritual deodorant. We're drifting further into the world of dethroned queens, the ones history softly brushed aside, like dust from velvet sleeves. Tonight we'll wander through a few more stories of women who wore crowns briefly, then found themselves trading royal duties for prayer beads, long walks, and occasionally, very polite bitterness. No drama, just soft sighs, and the occasional awkward royal exile. Let's float onward. Whoa, the forgotten Empress Eugénie of France. Empress Eugénie, last Empress of the French, wife of Napoleon III, a man who spent his political career trying very hard to convince everyone that he was just as good as the first Napoleon. Spoiler, history did not agree. Eugénie was elegant, sharp-witted, fond of fashion, and deeply confident that monarchy was simply the proper order of the universe, the cosmic equivalent of tidy socks. Then France declared a republic. Again, because France enjoys republics, the way some people enjoy collecting scented candles. Frequently, and with increasing enthusiasm, the imperial couple fled. Napoleon III died in exile, and Eugénie simply kept going. She lived in England. Quiet country estates, long walks, tea, and more tea. She outlived almost everyone. She wore mourning for decades, a soft shadow of a once glittering court, and every so often she'd attend a public ceremony, staring into the distance like she could still hear the faint rustle of silk in the Tuileries Palace. She did not return to France. She preferred silence. The ex-empress became a quiet old lady who hosted small gatherings, told gentle stories, and let time fold around her like velvet curtains. Sometimes the fall is loud, but the living afterwards is just and soft. Whoa, Queen Sophia of Greece, the rule of almost. Now we drift to Greece, to Queen Sophia, German-born sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II, which already tells you her family gatherings were probably equal parts tense and aggressively formal. She married the future king of Greece and tried, sincerely, to be supportive, graceful and helpful, which is usually the first hint that history is planning something unkind. Greece went through political upheaval, a few revolutions, some disagreements, and by disagreements I mean shouting, exile, and people waving flags in strongly emotional ways. Sophia was exiled not once, but twice, which feels like the universe offering a sequel nobody asked for. She fled to Switzerland, she paced gardens, she wrote letters, and one imagines her occasionally muttering, "I did not sign up for this degree of drama." Her husband died. Her son eventually retook the throne, and Sophia returned briefly. Then it all toppled again. Monarchy dissolved. She was exiled again permanently. Sophia lived her final years quietly. No tears, no speeches. Just a queen who spent more time being exiled than actually ruling. Walking through quiet European parks, feeding birds and remembering a kingdom that never fully embraced her. Sometimes queens don't lose the throne once. They lose it repeatedly, like a royal version of misplacing your glasses, except with more angry parliaments and fewer helpful relatives. Whoa, Maria of Yugoslavia, the gentle ghost of a fallen kingdom. Let's float gently to Yugoslavia now, a country that no longer exists, which always adds a certain poetic gloom to things. Maria of Yugoslavia was kind, educated, more artist than politician, the sort of woman who would rather paint a meadow than listen to ministers argue about railroads. Her husband, King Alexander III, was assassinated in 1934. Suddenly she was queen no longer, merely a widow in a black veil, clutching her young son's hand. Soon Yugoslavia itself crumbled in war. Monarchy vanished like mist, and Maria left quietly, as if apologizing for the inconvenience. She moved to England, bought a farmhouse, wore old coats, tended gardens, drove tractors, yes, tractors, because crowns are temporary but farm equipment is forever. She lived simply, almost anonymously. No court, no jewels, just a queen-turned farmer who spent her days pruning hedges and writing letters. When villagers discovered who she had once been, they were surprised. She laughed softly and kept gardening. It turns out some queens don't fight fate. They just plant roses instead. Whoa, the tragic serenity of Queen Marie Antoinette's mother. Now a gentle detour. Not Marie Antoinette. We all know her story. And it is decidedly not bedtime material. But her mother, Empress Maria Theresa's daughter-in-law, Maria Josepha of Saxony, a quiet queen of Poland and electress of Saxony. Never crowned. Never. Welcome back. Settle in again. The world is quiet. The lights are low. And we drift once more into the gentle melancholy of queens, who traded crowns for obscurity, silk for shawls, and royal proclamations for afternoon tea in someone else's country. If you're sleepy, that's perfect. These queens often felt the same, except their exhaustion came from political coups, court gossip, and chronic disappointment. Ours comes from, existing. Let's drift along. Queen Caroline Matilda of Denmark, too modern for her own court. Caroline Matilda, sister to King George III, young, bright, fond of music, dancing, and the radical idea that women should be able to open windows and breathe air. She was married off to King Christian VII of Denmark, who, to put it gently, was not well. He preferred partying, pranks, and occasionally stabbing furniture. Court doctors debated whether he was mad or simply very enthusiastic about being unpredictable. Caroline Matilda, meanwhile, was bored, lonely, and probably wondering if requesting a refund on a royal marriage was allowed. It was not. Enter Dr. Johann Struensee, physician, Enlightenment thinker, strong jawline, had ideas like vaccines and education, which already made the court nervous.
He and the Queen became close.
Perhaps very close. Let's just say Denmark suddenly had more reforms and more gossip. The conservative nobles did not appreciate either. Eventually there was a coup, because nothing ruins an Enlightenment romance like aristocrats clutching pearls. Struensee was executed. Caroline Matilda was exiled to a quiet palace in Germany. She was only 21. She never saw her children again. She lived quietly, riding horses and staring out rainy windows. She died a few years later, possibly of fever. A gentle, fated queen, remembered mostly as the one who was too alive for the court she married into. Sometimes exile isn't loud. Sometimes it's just silence and empty corridors and dresses never worn again. The ghost queen of Madagascar, Ranavalona III. Now we drift far from Europe, across oceans and tropical winds, to Madagascar. Ranavalona III was crowned,
Queen while European powers were
circling the world with the enthusiasm of crows around a picnic. She tried diplomacy. She negotiated. She signed things. She hoped. France responded with colonization, very decisively, because of course they did. Her palace was seized, her crown was taken, and she was placed on a ship and gently, but firmly relocated to Algeria, with attendants, of course, because exile is still exile, even when someone politely provides cushions. In exile, she maintained dignity. She hosted tea. She wore silk. She continued to sign her letters as queen, because the heart rarely abdicates even when the government says so. She visited Paris once, and they stared at her like an elegant relic from a museum that breathed. She died quietly, far from the island that still whispered her name in the rustle of palm leaves. Her throne became a tourist attraction. She became a memory, and sometimes the land remembers better than history books. Queen Margarita of Bulgaria, a crown in the shadows. Next we drift over to Bulgaria, late 20th century. Crowns were already somewhat old-fashioned, but still meaningful. Queen Margarita was never crowned. Her husband, Tsar Simeon II, became king as a child, lost his throne during World War II and fled into exile. Margarita married him later in faraway Spain. She lived decades as a queen without a kingdom, a royal in plain clothes, shopping at stores, standing in line, reading newspapers about a homeland she could not return to. Then, ironically, her husband later returned not as king but as prime minister, which must have been the most confusing and bureaucratic fairy tale ending imaginable. Margarita stayed quiet. She did not give grand speeches. She smiled. She lived between shadows and headlines, never officially dethroned, never truly crowned. Her story is a reminder. Sometimes queens don't fall. They simply never fully rise. a crown hovering in midair, like a soap bubble. Beautiful, fragile, easy to miss. Julia Domna, the Roman empress who carried the empire on her shoulders, then just carried books. Now let's drift back further. Rome. Marble, incense, sandals, those impressive but probably uncomfortable togas. Julia Domna, Syrian-born, brilliant, philosopher. Strategist, married to Emperor Septimius Severus, who appreciated her mind, which was rare enough in Roman politics to require a second look. She helped run the empire. Hosted scholars. Ignored petty senators with the skill of someone who has practiced selective hearing. Then her husband died. Her son Caracalla became emperor. He was, let's call him moody with violent tendencies. When he died, Eve... What happened to forgotten queens who lost their thrones? Part 7. History remembers the powerful, but often forgets the women who lost everything. Today, we look at another queen who disappeared into the shadows after losing her crown. Empress Dowager Tixi, the dragon lady who lost an empire, China. She ruled behind the curtain. She shaped emperors, commanded armies, and dictated policy. But when the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911, everything changed. Fate. Tixi never lived to see China's monarchy fall. She died just one day after her nephew emperor was poisoned, allegedly by her orders. Yet after her death, her empire crumbled. The monarchy was abolished. Her successors were stripped of power. Her legacy was rewritten by rivals and revolutionaries. The woman who once ruled China from behind a silk screen became a symbol of a dying empire. Feared, blamed, misunderstood. A life after the throne? Tixi never faced exile, never faced punishment. But history punished her in another way. She was branded a villain by those who came after her. In many ways, that is the harshest fate, not losing power, but losing your story. A lesson from her fall. Power can build an empire, but history decides your reputation. Sometimes the throne doesn't kill you. Being forgotten does. Tell me if you want part 8. We still have queens who vanished into cloisters, queens forced into marriages again, and queens who rose back from ruin. Some queens go down in glory, others vanish into quiet loneliness. Today we remember a queen whose crown was taken not by war or rebellion, but by the man she trusted. Catherine of Braganza, the queen who left without a king, England and Portugal. She came from Portugal to England, married King Charles II, and became queen at only 23. But she was a foreigner in a suspicious court, a Catholic in a Protestant kingdom, and worst of all, she had no heirs. Fate. When Charles II died, Catherine lost everything at once. No children to secure her power. No political role. Surrounded by enemies who once envied her crown, but unlike many dethroned queens, she did not fade away. She returned to Portugal and, in a twist of fate, became a ruler again. Not as a wife, not as a consort, but as regent of Portugal, ruling on behalf of her brother and nephew, from rejected queen to sovereign leader. Life after the throne. Catherine lived quietly but powerfully in Lisbon. She rebuilt her dignity, helped stabilize Portugal, protected her family's dynasty. No drama, no executions, just quiet strength and survival. Sometimes the best revenge is simply endurance. A lesson from her fall. Not every dethroned queen ends in tragedy. Some women don't need a king to be powerful. They become sovereign in their own right. Say the word and I'll bring you part 9. Featuring queens who fled disguised as commoners, queens who became nuns, and one queen who rebuilt her life in complete secrecy. Some queens faced exile, some faced silence, but a rare few escaped with nothing, not even their identity. Today we meet a queen who vanished into history like a ghost. A Queen Isabella of Hainaut, the queen who was replaced by her own in-laws, France. Married at just 10 years old to the future King Philip II of France, Isabella was meant to unite kingdoms and secure alliances. But medieval queens lived at the mercy of two things: politics and childbirth. When she failed to produce an heir quickly enough, Philip turned against her. He humiliated her publicly, threatened to annul the marriage, and even tried to send her back to her father, once her without a crown. France was ready to discard their queen. Fate, revenge by fate. Ironically, the moment Isabella finally gave birth to a son, the court rushed back to praise her. But fate had a cruel twist. Shortly after giving France its precious heir, Isabella died at age 19, a queen who never really got to live her own life. The kingdom wept for her, the same kingdom that once wanted her gone. She was buried with honors, remembered not as a failed queen, but as the mother of a king. Her quiet legacy: she never ruled long, never fought wars, never led armies. Yet through tragedy she secured her place. History rarely remembers queens who tried, only those who delivered, and sometimes delivering came at the highest price. Lesson: in royal courts, a woman's worth could change overnight. One day forgotten, the next immortalized. Not all fallen queens disappear. Some become legends only after they're gone. Would you like part 10? Next, a queen who escaped dressed as a peasant, and another who lived undercover in a convent to survive. Hey again, settle your shoulders, soften your breathing. We're drifting a little further tonight, floating after 2 more queens, who slipped quietly out of power, and then slipped almost out of history. Sometimes defeat isn't loud. Sometimes it's just footsteps fading in a hallway, a cloak drawn low, and a crown quietly set aside forever. Let's wander into their twilight. A Queen Violent of Bar, the dowager who refused to leave France. Violent, or Yolande depending on the chronicler's mood, married into France at the tail end of the 14th century. She had charm, connections, and a family tree that twisted into half the courts of Europe. Always useful. She also had ambition, which understandably made everyone nervous. Her husband, King John II's grandson Charles, reigned briefly, and like many kings in this story, he died inconveniently early. So there she was, a widow, with fading political leverage, and a French court very politely, and occasionally not politely, suggesting she move along. Surely, dear queen, you will retire quietly to a tasteful convent, they said in a tone that suggested it was less of a question and more of a gentle shove toward the door. But Violent said, essentially, no. She stayed. She remained in Paris, hosting salons, whispering in corners, writing letters that made entire councils sweat, and somehow navigating factional politics with the serenity of a cat who knows no one can make it leave the sofa. Even after her influence dwindled, she lingered, a quiet shadow in royal chambers, a remnant of a crown, too polite to exile, and too dangerous to ignore. Her fall was not dramatic. It was a slow, graceful fade, like a candle burning down, without ever being fully snuffed. And then she slipped into death, almost unremarked, as though the kingdom exhaled. And finally, she let go. Some queens don't vanish in storms. They simply refuse to move, until history whispers them into stillness. Queen Christina of Sweden, the one who walked away on purpose. Now let's drift north, where winters bite. Crowns are heavy, and occasionally, a queen decides she'd rather do absolutely anything else. Christina of Sweden was, well, unconventional would be the polite term. Born in 1626, she inherited the Swedish throne as a child, grew up surrounded by military men, books, and expectations heavy enough to bend steel. She was brilliant, sharp-tongued, fond of masculine clothing, philosophical debates, and not particularly fond of the rather pressing suggestion that she produce an heir. In a world built entirely around dynasties, she looked at marriage and politely said, "No, thank you, I'd actually rather read." Naturally, this confused everyone. A woman refusing to marry, refusing to produce children, refusing to do the one job medieval and early modern monarchies gave queens. Outrageous. And then, in one of history's calmest rebellions, Christina did something almost no monarch ever dared. She abdicated, voluntarily, set the crown down, and walked out the palace doors with a dignity only someone very, very tired can muster. She even converted to Catholicism in Protestant Sweden because she enjoyed being complicated. Some called her eccentric, some called her brilliant, many called her confusing. She traveled Europe, met philosophers, alchemists, artists, sometimes admired, sometimes unwelcome, always unpredictable. She never truly found a throne again, but she found something rarer, her own life. Not exile, not imprisonment, Not a convent forced on her by gossiping courtiers. Just a woman who decided she preferred pens to crowns, friendship to dynastic duty, curiosity to obedience. History never quite figured her out, and you get the impression she preferred it that way. She died in Rome, buried among popes. A queen who lost her throne, not through betrayal, or war, or childbirth, but choice. A quiet rebellion, and perhaps the most peaceful fall of all. In the gentle truth of losing power, not every dethroned queen fell by blade or poison. Some slipped out of relevance, like a sigh. Some lingered too long, because letting go felt like dying. Some walked away, because wearing jewels was lonelier than silence. Queens didn't always fall with screams. Sometimes it was simply the sound of court doors closing and footsteps down a marble hall. We often imagine crowns crashing to the floor, but sometimes they were just quietly set aside, as though someone thought, "This is heavy, and I am tired." And perhaps that is the softest tragedy, or the softest freedom. If you'd like, we can drift next into part 11, where we'll meet a queen who pretended to be dead just to escape court life, and another who spent decades believing she'd someday reclaim. She never truly found a throne again, but she found something rarer, her own life. Not exile, not imprisonment, not a convent forced on her by gossiping courtiers. Just a woman who decided she preferred pens to crowns, friendship to dynastic duty, curiosity to obedience. History never quite figured her out, and you get the impression she preferred it that way. She died in Rome, buried among popes. A queen who lost her throne, not through betrayal, or war, or childbirth, but choice. A quiet rebellion, and perhaps the most peaceful fall of all. In the gentle truth of losing power, not every dethroned queen fell by blade or poison. Some slipped out of relevance, like a sigh. Some lingered too long, because letting go felt like dying. Some walked away, because wearing jewels was lonelier than silence. Queens didn't always fall with screams. Sometimes it was simply the sound of court doors closing and footsteps down a marble hall. We often imagine crowns crashing to the floor, but sometimes they were just quietly set aside, as though someone thought, "This is heavy, and I am tired." And perhaps that is the softest tragedy, or the softest freedom. If you'd like, we can drift next into part 11, where we'll meet a queen who pretended to be dead just to escape court life, and another who spent decades believing she'd someday reclaim. Welcome back. Take a slow breath in and a longer one out. Tonight we're walking into quieter corridors, moments where crowns slipped, not with drama, but with weary breaths, petty letters, and the faint rustle of silk disappearing down a side hallway. Some queens fall loudly, some cling to their titles with both hands, knuckles white, voices trembling, telling anyone who will listen, "I am still queen." And some just pretend to die and hope no one asks too many questions. Royal dignity was always fragile. A crown could shine like heaven in the light and feel strangely brittle in the dark. So let's drift along and meet them. The queens who faded, lingered, or tiptoed out of their thrones like slightly embarrassed houseguests who overstayed the dinner table. Queen Ingeborg of Denmark, the queen who refused to be unmarried, France. Our journey starts in medieval France again, because France had a habit of collecting unhappy queens, like one collects regrettable furniture, expensive, dramatic, and often returned. Ingeborg married King Philip II of France in 1193. A glorious day, apparently. Trumpets, banners, choirs, and then almost immediately disaster. On their wedding night, Philip, whose romantic tact was world-renowned, in exactly 0 circles, decided he did not like his new wife. Some said she spoke too little. Some whispered she cried too much. Others suggested Philip simply saw a new political deal he preferred. Either way, by dawn, he had already decided to annul the marriage. Yes, the morning after the wedding. Efficient in a cruel sort of way, he tried to send her back to Denmark. She said no. He locked her in a convent. She escaped. He tried another annulment. She appealed to the Pope. He ignored it. She begged again. And so it went. For 20 years. 2 decades of polite letters, not so polite letters, and the occasional papal sigh. Ingeborg refused to stop calling herself Queen of France, even as she lived in relative isolation, supported only by her stubbornness and a dwindling handful of loyal clerics. Philip remarried, illegally, inconveniently, and with the full arrogance of a man, convinced rules only apply to other people. The church, predictably offended, eventually forced him to take Ingeborg back in title. Though not in affection, she never regained influence, rarely saw court, and lived mostly as a quiet ghost in royal records. But she won in her own way. She died still legally Queen of France, having outstubborned kings, cardinals, and French bureaucracy, which is, as experts will confirm, one of the toughest opponents known to man. A quiet victory, a lonely one. Some crowns are reclaimed, but never worn again. Ojciec Queen Barbara Radziwiłł, the love story. That turned to whispers, Poland, Lithuania. Now we drift east, where royal romance was just as dangerous, and occasionally sweet enough to fool everyone. For a moment, Barbara Radziwiłł was beautiful, witty, ambitious. In other words, exactly the sort of woman the Polish-Lithuanian court considered suspicious. Because how dare she? She fell in love with King Sigismund II Augustus, a rare genuine love match in a world where marriages were usually arranged by extremely serious men holding scrolls and arguing about maps. They married secretly. Of course, the Polish nobles were horrified. Too glamorous, too independent, too Lithuanian, even though Lithuania was technically part of the Union. Details. Sigismund tried to make her queen. The court tried to stop him. Noble families hissed ancient rivalries, like angry peacocks in fur cloaks. Eventually, he succeeded. She was crowned. And then, she fell ill. Whispers began. Poison, they murmured. Jealous nobles, they muttered. Court conspiracies, they hummed in corridors. In reality, she likely died from cancer or infection, but suspicion clung to her memory. Like smoke, she reigned briefly, loved fiercely, and then vanished. Sigismund wept so dramatically that foreign ambassadors mentioned it in reports, which means he wept enough to make professional diplomats uncomfortable. A truly impressive achievement. Barbara was not forgotten out of disdain, but out of grief. Sometimes queens disappear, not because the world hated them, but because the world couldn't bear to remember how fragile royalty really was. She never lived long enough to be exiled or dethroned, but her crown slipped anyway, taken not by enemies, but by frailty. Sometimes the throne loses you, even when you never let go. Queen Elizabeth Farnese, the queen who never stopped plotting, Spain. Now let's float a bit south, to Spain, where court politics were thicker than summer heat, and twice as sticky. Elika, welcome back. Breathe in slowly, let the shoulders ease, and feel time loosen its grip just a little. We're gliding further tonight, to places where queens once whispered commands, and courts trembled, and where later, those same voices found themselves echoing in corridors. No one bothered to sweep anymore. Some queens fought exile, some surrendered to it, and some simply dissolved into quiet places, until history nearly forgot they ever breathed. Let's drift toward 2 women who slipped out of the spotlight, with soft steps and lowered gaze, their crowns left behind. Like glittering ghosts. Margaret of Valois, a queen hidden in the ivy, France. Margaret, or Marguerite if you want to sound particularly French and refined, was born to glittering chaos. Daughter of Catherine de' Medici, sister to French kings, and famously charming, she glided through court life like a swan raised by tigers. She married Henry of Navarre in a union meant to heal France's religious wounds. Instead, it served more as a gentle reminder that optimism is occasionally delusion wearing a nice dress. Their wedding was followed by the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, a cheerful little interlude in which the streets filled with fear and blood, because 16th century France never met a peaceful solution. It didn't immediately throw out a window. Margaret survived it, survived court conspiracies, survived being used as a political pawn, more enthusiastically than most playing pieces deserve. But she and Henry didn't get along, in the polite sense that they spent years undermining each other, and occasionally trying not to notice each other's lovers, running through the palace. Eventually, Henry became King of France as Henry IV, at which point he decided he needed a new wife. More fertile, more politically convenient, less Margaret, so she was quietly set aside, exiled to rural estates, a queen in title, a prisoner in practice. And there, something unexpected happened. She relaxed. She kept gardens, wrote memoirs, read poetry, entertained scholars and eccentrics and musicians, sometimes argued with her guards, but charmingly, as one does. Her exile lasted 18 years, long enough for ivy to creep over the walls, and for her pride to soften around the edges. Eventually, Henry invited her back to Paris. Respectful now, older, less inclined to make dramatic messes in church. She spent her final years as a sort of regal aunt, draped in velvets, telling stories about princes and disaster. To anyone wise enough to listen, history wanted to forget her. She outlasted the forgetting. When she died, people remembered her beauty, her wit, her scandals, and her stubborn refusal to vanish. Some queens reinvent themselves. Margaret simply waited until time came back around and found her still there, smiling faintly. Empress Eugénie, the widow among dust and silence, France again. Because France loved dethroned queens. Let's glide forward to the 19th century now, to another French queen, or empress technically, who watched her world collapse, almost overnight. Eugénie de Montijo married Napoleon III, a man who tried extremely hard to recreate his uncle's empire, and succeeded mostly in creating very good portraits and very bad wars. She was elegant, fashionable, sharp-minded, and quietly stubborn. Paris adored her gowns and gossiped about her opinions because society rarely knows what to do with a woman who thinks in more than silk and diamonds. When France fell to Prussia in 1870, the empire evaporated, like perfume spilled on cold marble. Napoleon fled. The palace shook. Crowds roared outside. Eugénie escaped disguised in plain clothes, slipping into a carriage, like a lady sneaking out of an opera she no longer enjoyed. She fled to England, to gray skies and modest estates, where she lived not as an empress, but as a widow of an idea. Her husband died in exile. Her only son died in a hopeless campaign in Africa. And she remained in a small house with portraits and lace curtains and newspapers yellowing on tables. She lived on, a royal ghost in Surrey, surrounded not by courtiers, but quiet staff and drifting memory. Visitors would call, politely, curiously, to see the last empress of France. She would receive them in black silk, soft-voiced, dignified, like a relic that refuses to admit it has become history. She died in 1920, a queen of nothing, a widow of everything, and one of the last women alive to remember the Second Empire as something real. Her throne turned to dust. She did not. Some queens lose their world and keep breathing anyway, softly, stubbornly, like a candle that refuses to go out even after the room has emptied. A whispered ending for tonight's queens. Sometimes losing, she threw herself across her surviving son, the future King Manuel II, shielding him with bare hands, because instinct sometimes outruns history. Portugal wept, but change was already coming. A revolution followed. The monarchy crumbled, like too dry pastry, and Amélie, who once presided over balls and operas, boarded a ship and left. Not screaming, not pleading, not clinging, just leaving. France welcomed her back. With polite nods and quiet curiosity, she lived near the sea, not in exile's bitterness, but in a soft detachment, like a woman who had seen too much grandeur to ever miss it again. She spent her days reading, walking gardens, telling small stories to friends, and occasionally glancing at waves, as though remembering a kingdom, now floating somewhere beyond the horizon. She never returned to rule. She never begged. She simply aged gracefully, a queen stripped not by scandal or failure, but by time and circumstance. Sometimes the crown leaves you, and you exhale, almost relieved. Queen Christina of Denmark and Norway, the hermit queen who preferred birds to courts, not to be confused with Christina of Sweden, the enthusiastic abdicator with the dramatic flair for religion. This Christina belonged to a quieter tragedy. She was queen consort of Norway and Sweden in the 12th century, a time when Scandinavian politics were mostly sword, snow, and long uncomfortable silences around council tables. Married young to King Eric III, she played her expected role. Dignified, dutiful, politely unhappy. Eric abdicated the throne to enter a monastery, a decision that, while spiritually admirable, left Christina awkwardly queen of nothing. Courtiers scattered, supporters evaporated. Her royal duties dissolved, like frost under morning sun, and Christina, perhaps tired of negotiating power, in a world shaped like winter and iron, chose solitude. She retired to a quiet estate, not far from religious houses, not quite a nun, not quite a secular lady, existing in that strange in-between, where forgotten queens often go. Visitors later wrote that she lived in prayer and contemplation, which is polite medieval phrasing for she really didn't want to deal with anyone anymore. She fed birds, prayed softly, walked forest paths, spoke rarely of crowns, and even less of politics. Her story became a whisper in chronicles. Her life a gentle blur, like a figure seen through mist. Sometimes power is heavy. Sometimes retreat is not surrender, but mercy for oneself. History often forgets women like Christina, because stillness does not scandalize, and peace does not demand ink. Yet there is a quiet dignity in choosing a life where leaves rustle louder than courtiers ever did. A soft thought for the night. Queens fall not only in battle, or in exile, or in court intrigue. Sometimes they fall into gardens, into prayer, into the sound of waves, into the rustle of trees, where no crown can find them. Some disappear from memory because they chose silence over spectacle. And there, in the hush beyond ceremony, they became more human than they ever were on a throne. Power fades, names fade, but softness sometimes survives longest of all. If you'd like to drift on, say continue and we'll move into part 14, where we'll follow queens who lived long enough to watch their kingdoms change without them, their portraits fading, while new rulers forgot their names. Some queens lose crowns, others lose nations and in themselves. Today we remember a queen whose fall was so tragic, history nearly erased her. Queen consort Amina bint al-Hussein of Jordan? No, a famous name survives. But this queen? She belonged to a kingdom that doesn't even exist anymore. So meet Queen Liliuokalani, the last queen of Hawaii. A queen born into paradise, but forced to watch it vanish. She wasn't just a monarch. She was a musician, a poet, a scholar, and deeply loved by her people. Yet in 1893, wealthy businessmen and U.S. Marines overthrew her throne. Her crime? Trying to protect her kingdom's independence. Her punishment? No public execution, no burning palace. Instead, silence and confinement. She spent months imprisoned in her own palace, sewing and writing music to numb the pain. She lost her land, her power, her crown, but she never bowed. When asked to sign away Hawaiian sovereignty forever, she refused. I yielded not to the bayonet, but to avoid bloodshed. The forgotten legacy. Stripped of her throne, she became a symbol, not of defeat, but dignity. She spent her final years fighting legal battles for her people, preserving Hawaiian culture, composing songs, including the famous Aloha Oe. They took her kingdom, but her voice became immortal, the queen without a crown. History almost buried her. But today, she stands as a reminder. Sometimes queens don't fall. They rise quietly and wait for the world to remember them. And Hawaii never forgot. Some queens lost crowns, some lost kingdoms. This one lost her name on purpose. She didn't fight an army. She didn't sign a treaty. She vanished. Meet Empress Go Sakuramachi, Japan's hidden empress. Japan's history remembers powerful samurai, shoguns, and emperors. But few know her story. She was one of Japan's last reigning empresses in the 18th century, a ruler of elegance, education, and fierce statecraft. Yet when her reign ended, there was no palace to retreat to, no luxury exile, no public humiliation. Instead, she walked away from the chrysanthemum throne and chose the life of a quiet citizen. Her crown, gone. Her royal authority, over. Her future, a whisper in silk. For a queen without a kingdom. Unlike queens forced into prison or poverty, she lived differently. Studied poetry, religion, and philosophy. Practiced tea ceremony and calligraphy. Lived in stillness, almost monk-like. Guided future royals quietly from the shadows. No drama. No rebellion. Just serenity lies after power. Her fate shows a rare truth. Not every queen ends in blood or betrayal. Some choose peace over politics. She became forgotten not by force, but by design. To the world, she faded into silence. To history, she was a ghost in royal robes. Her legacy: she never wore the crown again, but she shaped the future of Japan quietly, sometimes disappearing, is the greatest power a queen can have. Not every fallen queen is broken. Some simply step out of the light and let history search for them.